So hello, everybody. It is 7 o'clock and 38 seconds, which means we are raring to go for this first Film Fest of 2021 program. And I am so pleased to be here and welcome all of you to this really special program. My name is Sandra Brett, and I am the director of the Charleston Jewish Film Fest. First of all, many thanks to all of you who are participating in this classic film discussion where we are featuring the movie Goodbye Columbus. And I do hope that you will join us for our 4 upcoming films in this virtual spring 2021 series. And I have listed all of the movies in the chat, if you want to put them up there, Kim. And we've got 4 great movies coming up, and you could actually, while you're waiting for us to get started here, put your, you can actually pre-register for the next movies that you see over there on the right there. And they're all great, they're all different. We've really tried to pick a schedule of educational programs to go along with these movies. And I appreciate everybody's efforts in really getting these programs together. If you saw the article in the City Paper, you also get a very nice description of them. So this week's City Paper has a really great description. So anyway, you can also go to our Facebook page for information, or you can always email me, sbrettfilm@gmail.com. And I think that's going to be up there at some point too. And I'm happy to give you all the information. So the Film Fest is under the umbrella of the College of Charleston Yashik Arnold Jewish Studies program. Thank you very much to everyone from the department that has helped me do these films. We have the chairman of the department, Yaron, with us. Kim Browdy is a great help. And this year we also have the privilege of partnering with the Savannah Jewish Film Festival. And if anyone is here from Savannah, we welcome them and we thank their donors and supporters as well. So here's what our program is going to be for tonight. In a minute, I'm going to introduce Professor Ezra Cappell, who will begin our program with some insightful background information on Philip Roth and Goodbye Columbus. And then I want you to all start warming up your film critic chops, and we're going to hear some comments from a multi-generational panel. And then the part that we like best about Zoom programs is we'll have a very interactive Q&A. So while we're hearing all the comments from everybody else, think about what questions you might have for Ezra or anyone on the panel, or any comments about whether you liked the movie, whether you didn't like the movie. We hope that we get a nice discussion going about the movie after we hear everybody else's comments. Is everyone familiar with the chat button on the bottom there? If you have a question and you want to put it in the chat, please go ahead and do that. And then Ezra will call on you so that you can ask your question. Or if you're really shy, I guess we could ask it for you, but I don't think anyone here, from what I see here, looks like they're really shy. So I think that'll go really well. Or you can raise your hand if you want to. That's under reactions. You could raise your hand and we'll call on you. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what everybody has to say about this movie. It is a classic, but 50 years have gone by, and it'll be interesting to see what people think 50 years after this original movie. So tonight I'm honored, and I really am honored because he really is a very smart guy. I'm very honored to introduce Dr. Ezra Cappell. Has a joint appointment as Professor of Jewish Studies and Professor of English at the College of Charleston. Prior to coming to Charleston, Dr. Cappell was at the University of Texas at El Paso, where he was instrumental in starting a Jewish Studies program. He received his PhD from NYU. His publications include American Talmud, the cultural work of Jewish American fiction, which relates to our topic tonight. And his most recent book, hot off the press, is Off the Derech, Leaving Orthodox Judaism, which of course you can buy on Amazon or your favorite bookseller. He teaches a variety of really interesting courses at the College of Charleston on Jewish American literature and film, which is why we invited him to talk about Philip Roth's novella and movie tonight. He knows a lot about watches and the Holocaust. Let me just add that. So pretty much a jack of all trades, and you could probably ask him anything and he would know the answer. But tonight we are going to concentrate on Goodbye Columbus. So take it away, Dr. Cappell.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Sandra. And I'm really honored to be here and to be on such a wonderful and distinguished panel, which you've done a great. Sandra's done a fantastic job with the film festival here. And I'm really honored to be on this panel with her, with Leah Chase, with Carolyn Schneider, and of course, Kim Browdy is our expert in all things here, getting us going here on Zoom. So we appreciate I appreciate all of that wonderful help. I don't know if I'm going to be able to live up to that introduction there, Sandra. I mean, answer all questions about all things. I don't think that is actually even remotely accurate, but I do know a thing or two about Philip Roth, and I'm really eager to share some of those thoughts with everyone here tonight and talk a little bit about the novella and about the film, and really eager to hear our discussion and questions and our perspectives from a multi-generational panel here this evening. So thank you all for putting that together and for inviting me to be a part of it. So Philip Roth, and I have a short PowerPoint with some slides taken from just screenshots of the film that we'll talk a little bit about in a minute. But I just wanted to say Philip Roth has always been about, in his career, he talked about the ruthless intimacy of fiction. And that is really what he did. He always wanted to cut to the heart of the matter, to think about how he could get his audience, his reading audience, feeling in an intimate way of the most important issues of the day. And that evolved for him over a half a century career. He just passed away about almost 3 years ago now. And his work is starting to continue to garner tremendous influence and acclaim. They just made an HBO series. Some of you were on our Zoom we had last spring on the plot against America. This novella of his actually was one of his first books that he published, Goodbye Columbus and Other Stories, won the National Book Award for stories he had begun publishing in the mid-1950s. And in 1959, it won the National Book Award. Philip Roth was all of 26 years old when he won that award, one of the youngest awardees ever, and with good reason. It's a fantastic collection of stories, and one of the highlights of it is, of course, Goodbye Columbus, which was very controversial, as all the stories were when they came out. In fact, Philip Roth was known as sort of the bad boy of American fiction for many, many years. And this film really explains a little bit more about that, right? There's a lot to offend in the film, perhaps less so now, over half a century later. But certainly, if you think back to when he was publishing these stories in the 1950s, he was definitely doing his job of pushing people into uncomfortable places and making people encounter and deal with issues that were really important, but that most people would rather not. And I'll want to share with you some of those issues have to do with racism in America, institutionalized racism, something that we know quite a bit about today. And I'm just going to screen share with you so you could see this slide presentation. Let me pull that up here. And can you guys see that, I hope? Okay, great. Let me pull that up. There we go. All right. So Goodbye Columbus is the film version, was, of course, as I mentioned, based on the novella. And that's the first edition cover here. But by the time the film came out 10 years later, they were really playing up the 60s sexual revolution quite a bit more, a far more staid dust jacket to the novella here. And here you'll see, if you've watched the film, there's an awful lot of nudity and a lot of sexual activity, and that forms the basis of the plot too. Birth control, all of these issues were deeply important in the 1950s and deeply controversial. And certainly Roth was not shying away from all of that. And in particular, one other thing that was controversial was a lot of people thought that Philip Roth's work was anti-Semitic. Because he was labeled as a self-hating Jew, I believe, of course, totally erroneously. But I'm really eager to hear what our panelists think about that, and certainly what our audience members think and recall about that, maybe from the time when he started to publish stories. And he brushed all that aside. He thought his job was not to be sort of a flag bearer for any group, only for himself and his own writing, and get people to understand deeply about the characters that he had created. So we'll talk about that as well this evening. And so here in this very early scene, We see Neil Klugman is calling. There's all of these class issues and social issues here. And Neil Klugman is a kid. He's a city kid. In the novel, in the novella, he's from Newark, which is the city where Philip Roth was from. And Philip Roth said he never liked the term Jewish American writer. He said, don't call me a Jewish American writer. He said, call me a Newark Jew, he said. Not one word that I wrote did I write as a Jewish American writer, but every word I ever wrote, I wrote as a Newark Jew, he said. So he actually wanted more specificity in that sense, not the generalized term. Most writers would be offended by that because they wanted to speak to everyone, which he did as well. But he said, if you're already going to try to label me, be specific, call me what I really am. And in the novella, Neil Klugman comes from Newark. In the film, it's a little more unclear. It seems like he's more from the Bronx, and they are in Westchester as opposed to Newark and Short Hills. But racism and race take center stage from the very opening scenes of the movie and in the novella as well. The first question that the love interest asked Neil Klugman here, right? She says, "Are you a Negro?" She says to him, and he brushes aside and jokes about that. But Brenda is joking herself, but at the same time, she's, dealing with this question of race in a way that is obviously somewhat offensive at the same time. Even if she thinks of it as playful, we know it to not be so playful. We know that there's a real a problem with the kind of language that she's using here. You see the contrast between the beautiful appointments of the room she's in versus the Bronx porch dwellers here. They're out on the stoop, his Aunt Gladys and his uncle here, and they're all peppering him with questions. There's a lot of yelling. There's a lot of steamy cooking going on in the scenes that we're seeing here, as opposed to the very staid and beautiful Westchester home that Brenda comes from here. So we see that here. And there is an African-American cook in the Potamkin home. Her name is Carlotta, and she is not treated terribly nicely in the novella nor in the film either. And in fact, the only person who tries to talk to her nicely is Neil. And she just stares at him like, why you even talk? Like, she's not used to this, doesn't even know how to handle this, which is yet another indictment, I think, of the Potamkins and the way that they treat the help, let's just say here. And those issues come to the forefront in the novella. They're not quite as pronounced in the film version, but certainly they're there. And this becomes more important in the library scenes that we're going to see. There's a young African-American boy who comes to the library where Neil works, and he's asking about what Neil thinks of as the heart section, because he can't quite understand his accent. And they have this conversation about art. But really, Neil is sort of the champion of this African-American boy. And in the book, it's very clear that there's a very racist culture here in place. In the movie, it's not quite as heavy-handed, but one of the employees does in fact throw the boy out beforehand, thinking he's going to desecrate or do untoward things to the art books that he's very interested in learning about. And so instead you see Neil coming to kind of help him as much as he possibly can, kind of in this social crusader, social justice sort of warrior, which is sort of the role that Philip Roth, I think, sees of himself early on in his career as a Jewish American writer. He sees these values as deeply important to who he is. And, when the boy is looking at these pictures of Tahiti and these beautiful images of Gauguin, he says, yeah, that's the life, the boy says. And then we get this image of the Westchester, the beautiful home of the Potamkins here. And these issues of class are very important in the film and the novel. You see here, Neil is left alone in the house, and he explores and finds this tremendous refrigerator in the basement filled with fruit. And that's a theme that goes throughout the novel too, the incredible abundancy of life, that the incredible success and prosperity of the Potamkins versus the immigrant generation that Neil comes from. And we see that here. Here's a quote from the novel. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this is one of the things that Roth talks about in the novella. He says, "I opened the door of the old refrigerator. It was not empty. No longer did it hold butter, eggs, herring and cream sauce, ginger ale, tuna fish salad, sort of these old school things. But instead it's just fruit, right? Every color, every texture, and hidden within every kind of pit. And he goes on, he says, oh, Potamkin, fruit grew in their refrigerator and sporting goods dropped from their trees, he says. And so, you get that sense of the tremendous difference, the class differences of here's a Jewish family that really made it, got out of the ghetto, got out of the immigrant community in Newark or the Bronx, as it were, where I was born actually in the Bronx, which is a sort of a more universal setting, I think, for the movie. Most for a national audience may not have been aware of Newark, but everyone knows of the Bronx, right? And so in 1969, there wasn't anyone in America that didn't know that the Bronx meant more of a working class immigrant community. So I think that was that shift there. Just a little tidbit here. There, at one point in the film, they go to see the Odd Couple, and of course, the father, Mr. Potamkin, is played by Jack Klugman, the actor. There's a lot of Klugmans here, right? There's Neil Klugman, the character, and Jack Klugman, the actor, who is most famous for his role in The Odd Couple on television, which he started a year after this film came out. But of course, for those who really are big fans of Neil Simon, you'll recall that Jack Klugman actually played the same role in the Broadway play, starting, I think, in 65 through 67. So sort of a little in-joke here, I think, in the film here. Not quite like Hitchcock appearing, but kind of a little bit akin to that, I think. And then, of course, the themes of America, of American materialism, of making it. You have the brother who's the athlete at Ohio State, and this recording, this record of Goodbye Columbus that is played throughout the novella and also in the film version as well. And of course, Columbus is Columbus, Ohio, but it's also Columbus discovering America, right? The great promise of America, where so many Jews have met tremendous success in the post-war years, including, of course, the Potamkins. And here is their son, even though he's not the brightest bulb, let's just say, he's immediately made a manager, and here he is assuming his role and ordering all of the other workers around here. So I think we see that those social issues there of nepotism, of who gets ahead in America, is something that comes to the forefront in all of Roth's work, but in the film, we see it very clearly as well. And talking about that, I'm not going to read this whole quote here, but in talking about the Potamkin kitchen and bathroom business, their sinks, Roth writes that it was in the heart of the Negro section of Newark. Years ago, at the time of the Great Immigration, had been the Jewish section, and still one could see the little fish stores, the kosher delicatessens, the Turkish baths, where my grandparents had shopped and bathed at the beginning of the century. And it's this beautiful, beautiful passage that he writes about the differences and how now it's an African-American neighborhood, and they are following in those footsteps, he says, as only Roth could write. And I think that when you see that, you understand, I think, some of the power of the literature, which perhaps may not be as apparent in the film version. So really important to think about the differences between the film and the beauty of the language that Roth gets at here, I think, very, very powerfully. So I just wanted to move that. I'll just read that last line. He says that now, in fact, the Negroes are making the same migration, following the steps of the Jews, and those who remained in the Third Ward lived the most squalid of lives and dreamed in their fetid mattresses of the piney smell of Georgia, he says. And so we see that for sure. Some of the issues that offended people in the novella and in the film version, 1969, are this idea of, that the Jews are not always portrayed as the most wholesome characters. Here is Mr. Potamkin lecturing Neil about college learning and book learning versus the difficult life that you have to strive to make it in America. He says, let me tell you something, in the real world, you need a little ganef in you. And he even asks him, do you even know what that means? And he says, yes, it means thief. And just towards the end, the last half hour of the film, you see this great big Jewish wedding, which of course, Hollywood loves Jewish weddings. And there's this moment where you see the contrast of the nouveau riche here who are rising up in America. And you have Mr. Potamkin saying, Seymour to one of his friends, Seymour, it's a machaya here. Today this is going to be the classiest affair of the year, as everyone is shoveling in food in this very gauche sort of and very unclassy sort of way. And so in the end, you have these characters that are from I don't want to have too much of a spoiler alert here, but you could see there's a tremendous difference in the ways in which these two characters are. Brenda in the country club scene and her boyfriend with his deep roots, much like Philip Roth and the immigrant generation, and they don't mix, right? And to its credit, the film version does not have a Hollywood ending here. So I think it stays very true to the novella. And in some ways, the film does not, it shows its half century of age. And in other ways, I think it really still speaks powerfully to some very important ideas that hopefully we'll hear more about from our panelists here and from our audience members. So that was the few ideas I wanted to throw out there, and then open it up for the rest of our panelists.
Well, thank you. That was really a great introduction to the movie. And I know you don't want to spoil the ending, but I do feel that since we told people about the movie, it's okay for our panelists to refer to the ending as part of their comments, because it is pretty important. So I don't know, do you just want to tell us what the ending is briefly, Ezra?
So, in the end, that whole idea of the sexual revolution of the 1960s comes full circle at the end of the film. In the earlier part, Neil is very worried about birth control, and he has Brenda go into the city and get a diaphragm birth control device, and then the parents discover this device when she goes back to Radcliffe, and he believes that she planted this because she really just wanted a summer fling, wants to get out of the relationship with this very lower class sort of Jewish character. And he's probably right about that. And in the end, the parents forbid her to continue to see him, and she basically doesn't put up any fight whatsoever. And the last scene is him walking out, kind of stunned, alone without her, to head back home in the novella to Newark and to a different life than this country club existence in a beautiful, wealthy neighborhood like Short Hills, New Jersey, or Westchester County, New York. And basically, if we see early novels in many ways as Bildungsroman, as a novel of becoming a Philip Roth himself, sort of, taking a very different tack, at least in terms of his fictional, persona here. Of course, in his own life, he was rising very quickly towards the heights of American society and world culture. But in his fiction, had his feet very squarely in Newark, never left Newark, and was always back with his imagination always there in Newark. So that's how the novella ends. And again, the Hollywood film doesn't have a nice happy ending. It ends in a way that is unexpected for a Hollywood film version of a novella, in which it's that sad realization that these two characters are not really going to be together after this torrid summer fling that they've had.
Thank you.
Sure.
So now I'm going to call on Leah Chase to give us a little bit of insight into how she felt about the film in 1969, how she felt about rewatching it, and also how you feel about it after hearing Ezra talk about it. So just a couple of comments on your different views based on those experiences.
Well, thank you, Sandra. I have to admit, I didn't like it when I saw it, and I don't like it now. It was very embarrassing. I didn't want anybody who wasn't Jewish to see it. I was ashamed of it. I grew up in those piney woods of Georgia in a small town. I was the only Jewish kid in school. And so my friends realized that this was about Jews. And we didn't know about New York Jews. Not at all. Newark wasn't even part of our language. And sitting on stoops, that kind of thing didn't happen in our world. We had maids that served dinner, and we were certainly middle-class Jews in West Point, Georgia. I even had a maid that served meals up until a few years ago when she passed away after working for me for 44 years. right here in Charleston. So, you know, it was very promiscuous. Those things just weren't done in my world. And even today, I guess from that kind of background and the culture that I grew up in, I'm still embarrassed by the film. It was, I mean, my friends, we didn't wear bikini bathing suits. We wore one-piece bathing suits. Anyway, those were some of the things that bothered me, particularly the materialism and the rough language of the parents, of the father. And the worst part was the wedding with the gorging of food and the brassiness of some of the women's, the way they were dressed. It was all just, oh, I just wanted to hide. And so that I don't really feel any different today than I did then. And I was already married with 4 children when I, you know, in '69 when the movie came out, if I saw it that year. So I guess that's, I'm kind of square.
And you don't feel, Leah, you don't think that it's, given the changes in our culture in the last 50 years, you still feel that it's so, and there, I mean, one of the things Philip Roth always talked about was that it's very hard for fiction writers to keep up with reality, right? That's the real problem, right? You write these fanciful novels that seem to take off on the craziest ideas, but actually reality takes it over, right? And goes even surpasses it. So I'm wondering, you haven't seen any changes? Your attitude is still the same. It doesn't get worse than the chopped liver scene in the wedding scene in the movie.
Right, the chopped liver. Oh, that was terrible. I mean, I've certainly seen today's reality and how much more is accepted. I mean, even just young people living together for years without marriage. And all that has become so acceptable. But that doesn't mean it changes the way I feel. Mm-hmm. It really doesn't. I mean, I recognize that it's changed, but I don't approve of it. I wouldn't, you know, it's still embarrassing, the film.
Yeah.
And, you know, the young people, particularly young girls and young men in the summertime, they wear very little clothing.
Right. Well, if it's any consolation, Philip Roth didn't approve of all that materialism either, right? That's why, you know, he was writing as a satirist of many of the foibles of the Jewish community in some ways. And, you know, when you think of a satirist, he's the one who's trying to uphold like the true values of what he sees as the real values of a society. And he sees, you know, Jewish culture, Jewish American culture in its tremendous push towards materialism. And you got a sense of that in that chapter, in that quote when he's talking about that they have just this overabundance of fruit and sporting goods that he could dream of as a kid growing up in Newark. If he could get a real baseball and a leather ball, you know, this was a gift from heaven. And like these rich kids, his attitude is like they don't even care, they even put them in the garage, they just lay around on the lawn, you know. So he's very strongly critiquing a lot of the excesses of American materialism. He's doing it through the only community he knows in his bones, right? And that is the Jewish community. Right.
But he's laughing at that world.
Yes.
I mean, he's laughing at it. I mean, he's poking fun at it.
Yes.
And I just found it very disturbing when I watched it when I was younger. And I would rather just forget about it now.
Well, you can blame Sandra for that then, right? So, I mean.
Okay, you can blame me afterwards, Leah.
Yeah, it's okay. I told you that I was really going to be old-fashioned and square.
Well, that's why we invited you. We wanted to hear different generations, the perspective of different generations. So that's right. It's great. And also, I'm also from the North. I'm not from a small Southern town. So for me, it was really interesting to hear what your perspective was, because it was very different from the way you grew up, if you grew up in the North. All right, moving on to Carolyn Schneider, who is a junior at College of Charleston, a wonderful student majoring in French and what else was it?
Communications major, minoring in French and film studies.
Right. So interested in film. She has been helping us with the film festival, does a great job, and obviously did not see this movie in 1969. Saw it afresh last weekend. So your thoughts on the movie, and also after hearing Ezra talk about it, does that change anything you think about the movie?
So hearing Dr. Cappell talk about it gave me more context for the movie because I went into it knowing nothing other than the name. I did not like this movie, but I didn't like it for different reasons than Leah. To me, a lot of it just felt very outdated and kind of pieced together. And having seen now some of the excerpts from the novella, and that kind of helped it make more sense. But in the movie, it felt very disjointed, and like topics would just come up out of nowhere and then disappear and then come back for to me at least, it's like just to cause problems. So I liked some of the scenes, like the Jewish wedding reminded me of a lot of family events I went to. I have family who were New York Jews. And so like all of that kind of the big events, that very much so, while it didn't look exactly like the ones I've been to, very much so reminded me of that feeling. But otherwise I felt a lot of the movie to me seemed very outdated.
Yeah. Carolyn, when you talk about like threads that don't really go anywhere, like the race issue, right? That in the novella is so deeply important to the development of this character. In the film version, it's just there, right, at the beginning especially, and then it kind of just recedes and it's never really brought back up again, right? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, they kind of use it almost as like a device, like to look at class and then just ignore it. Exactly. It's like they talk about it and then it's kind of like a forget it ever happened.
Exactly.
After the first like half hour of the movie or so.
Right. And in some ways, of course, it's perhaps even more offensive to engage in it without really dealing with it properly, right? So just than to not at all, right? It's just there for what purpose exactly, right?
Yeah, like it's there basically to display like see, they're upper class, they're not going to treat people of color as well, is kind of what it felt like to me. Mm-hmm. Especially like the way that they presented it, because then you also have Neil, who is a bit of a lower class, who is more understanding. So it's kind of both presenting it as a race and a class issue all in one, the way it was addressed.
Yeah.
And then by just ignoring it very much so, felt like for the rest of the film, just kind of felt like see, we're catering to a little bit here, and then we're just going to pretend it never happened.
Right. Right. It's an excellent point you make, Carolyn. And of course, Philip Roth, though, for those of us who are interested in Philip Roth, and perhaps we'll do another one of these. We'll see if Sandra wants to put this on the agenda maybe next year. Philip Roth, wrote a very important book called The Human Stain, in which the main character, Coleman Silk, is a light-skinned African-American man who passes himself as a Jewish person in order to rise in society, just like the Potamkins did. But of course, he does so in academia and in the intellectual world. And so he's dealing with that issue of race and class and religion in America in a far more nuanced and developed way, even than he's doing. Forget about the film, right? I mean, this is his first book. He's 26 years old. It's a novella. But in The Human Stain, he fully engages with these issues of race in America, cutting right to the heart of America. So I think you would enjoy that maybe. And of course, they made a film version of it which has so many problems. We won't really get into all of them, but Anthony Hopkins plays Coleman Silk, and he doesn't look either Jewish or African American in it, so it's very confusing. I think a very strange casting in the film, but maybe we could talk about that in another later event here. But certainly I agree with everything you said, Carolyn. Those are really excellent points to make.
Could I say something?
Sure.
I didn't even understand the title for years until seeing the film this time. Mm-hmm. It was the brother who was saying goodbye to Columbus, Ohio, where he had played basketball. Right. And to me, that didn't even fit into the film, what it was all about. I mean, that was a surprise, seeing it the second time. I finally understood the title.
Yeah.
And as Carolyn brought up about, the help in the kitchen, the Black woman. I mean, we didn't call them Negroes, and we didn't call them Blacks, and we didn't call them African Americans. They were colored people, and they all worked in domestic. I mean, most of my friends had domestic help that served meals and did the cooking and the laundry, and it was just accepted, and it wasn't considered racist in the 50s. And so now I see, I see the world with different eyes, of course.
Yeah.
Yes, and certainly, yeah, we all see these issues quite differently 50 years later, of course, and I think that's important for us to recognize, right? And certainly, America today is taking a very good, long needed look at institutionalized racism and many of these issues that Philip Roth tentatively started to engage in, in the 1950s. I think that's what I'm saying about In the Human Stain. Half a century later, he's engaging with them more fully. And certainly as a culture, we're beginning to do some of that work now, much needed work in understanding the issues that are apparent in Goodbye Columbus in the film, for sure. And in some of the issues that you're bringing up now. So for sure.
Yeah. Okay, moving on, since I'm the director, I get to participate in the panel with my son, David. Wave, David.
Oh, he's on now.
Yeah, and I happened to be in San Francisco last weekend, so we watched the movie together. I did ask David to read the Vincent Canby review from 1969, so we had a little bit of background on the film, and Canby's review was pretty positive, although I don't think you read the novella, did you, David? That it was from.
Oh, he needs to unmute. I don't know if he's able to.
I didn't read the novella.
Right, but you did read the interviews, or you did read the reviews, so you knew that there was a backstory to Philip Roth. And I thought we had a pretty nice conversation about the film. David, you want to kind of just summarize that?
Yeah, I think the main, I was expecting the class theme to be a really strong theme, and I didn't see that as the major kind of message that the movie was trying to get across. That seemed pretty subtle to me. I thought the guy was clearly not as wealthy as the woman, but he navigated her world comfortably. So to me, it wasn't like sort of this poor person shows up and is just in awe of all of the luxury that he sees. I felt like he was more of an intellectual who had somewhat rejected that kind of stuff, and was pretty critical of the family, and I thought that was what she was attracted to about him, that he kind of rebelled against all of the stuff that she was taught to seek, and also why ultimately she didn't see a future with him, because she knew that he just didn't really his long-term goals were basically sort of drifting kind of somewhat aimlessly, and she didn't want to be with someone like that. So it was fun for a little bit, but not something that she could see a long-term future.
And I wrote notes from our conversation, and I don't remember if it was you or Mackenzie, David's wife, who said Neil thought he was doing something positive as opposed to grubby go-getters that just wanted to get ahead. And I thought that described it pretty well, what the situation was. At David's college graduation, Barbara Kingsolver was the speaker, who most of you probably know her novels. And it was really inappropriate, I thought, choice in retrospect, because she kept going on about how all those do grads just wanted to make a lot of money. And this was at their graduation. And I asked David if that was true. And I think you said yes, actually. So, I think we, as the parent and the son, my idea of what I think success was for my kids and how I inculcated them with that idea of success, I could relate somewhat to the Alan McGraw character and, wanting my kids to succeed, although my parents were nothing like her parents. So I think I had a little bit more empathy for the movie than maybe either Leah or Carolyn did.
Well, Caroline liked the movie, right?
No, she
Not
said
really.
Not really.
she didn't
Not
like
really.
Not so much. Well, one of the things though that David that you were saying, I think what's really interesting about those distinctions about making it in America, right? Philip Roth wrote for such a long period of time that his own politics shifted rather precipitously over many decades, right? And so when he writes this novella, he's clearly on the side of the younger generation, those who are looking askance at society, at just making it and just trying to be successful. Whereas, he writes a novel called American Pastoral in the mid 1990s that looks back on the Vietnam era. And he was excoriated as being sort of this conservative, this guy looking back on this and looking at the generation of the sexual revolution, the people who are looking to try to change society, the people who, in the words of literary critic Morris Dickstein, talks about bringing American culture right up to the gates of Eden, right? Taking that this idea that we could have a more just and more perfect and more equitable society, movements that are still part of our culture and so much now are in the forefront today again. And people thought Philip Roth has gone on to the dark side of things, that he's become more of a neoconservative by the 1990s. And looking back on this, that he's really changed his politics. I don't think that's entirely true, but there's certainly an element of that. And he's certainly a very different writer in his 70s and 80s than he was in his 20s and 30s, that's for sure. And I think that his relationship to American prosperity and success evolves with his own changing fortunes in his own life, for sure, I think. So,
David, do you want to add anything before we keep going? One thing that you said, David, when we were talking about it was that you thought the cinematography was old-fashioned compared to the movies that you see now. Can you comment on that, Ezra?
The cinematography, yes. Well, I mean, it's very 60s-ish, right? There's a lot of attempts to be kind of cutting edge. There's a lot of attempts at the opening scene to be postmodern and seeing people for their parts and all of the sort of thing that they're trying to do. I mean, it reminded me some of those scenes of the kind of psychedelic moments that you see in a film like Midnight Cowboy, something like that, right? If you're familiar with that film. But I think that that those parts of it seem much more dated today, I think, even than the topics and the themes themselves, right? The way, the presentation of it, right? And the soft glow moments and the slow moments when she's diving into a pool. And, we see this stuff repeatedly. It's just so cliched even then. So there's a lot more we could say about it. I mean, I don't think Philip Roth was ever terribly happy about any of the film versions of his novels. Very few writers are, but certainly this was not one that he was deeply happy about, for sure. It could have been done in a far better way, that's for sure. I don't know if anyone here saw American Pastoral, which was made into a film a few years ago. Perhaps a little bit better in some ways, but there hasn't been. I mean, if you were to put them all together, Philip Roth deserves much better. I think the HBO series is the best yet of an adaptation of his work by far. But certainly, he had 33. There's a good 30 other books or 28 books or so left. That there may be many films made that could far exceed this. But yeah, I don't think there's much in there that we would look back on and look at as like this is a great example of high production values. I don't think anyone is thinking that when you watch this film. Perhaps you want to hire the liver sculptor, but other than that, I don't think there's much on that realm for us. I also though wanted to address a couple of these questions that are coming in on the chat, which are really interesting here. First, Nancy Barry is asking about, she's commenting on that the wedding scene seemed pretty dead on, perhaps, but that the relationship, meaning I assume the relationship between, Neil and Brenda had no substance. And I don't know about no substance for her, but I mean, that's part of the point, right? She sees this as a summer fling, and he is, of course, smitten and thinks that this is going to be something much different. And the dissonance between their expectations are what come crashing down at the end. So I agree. It's not based on a tremendous amount other than physical attraction and perhaps the needs for her. She just mentions at the beginning that in the film, certainly that she had just broken up with a fiance, and she runs into him at a party later on in the movie. So I think that plays a role in that as well. But I agree, we would want a deeper connection there for sure for a more modern, rom-com sort of film these days for sure. But I mean, the genre doesn't lend itself to such deep relationships, I think. And my colleague, who I'm glad is on here on the Zoom, Ashley Walters, she's asking about the figure of or the depiction of the Jewish American princess. And certainly this is something that Philip Roth was criticized for often. And he was often criticized for his female characters and for the way he portrayed them, particularly Jewish mothers, and also, as you mentioned, Jewish American princesses, spoiled female characters in his novels throughout his career. And I think it's an important question to ask, and an important topic that needs to be further explored beyond even the Zoom, but certainly, Roth. And today, this is a bigger question, right, about who gets to tell, what stories, right? And certainly Philip Roth as a male author this is an important issue, right? How is, if you, traditionally, he would say that, as a writer, this is what I need to do. I need to imagine myself into that world. And that is the work that he does. I was privileged to be a speaker we had this conference that was organized at Roth's 80th birthday party in Newark. And Roth spoke at that and did a reading sort of as like a valedictory lap and as sort of his last, he announced his retirement around then and didn't publish much anything after that really. And he said though that the hardest thing he ever did was in the book, which one is Sabbath's Theater, where you have a boy who goes off to war and dies, is shot down over the Pacific, and there's a mother in that novella, in the novel, it's not a novella, it's a big meaty novel, who really becomes almost catatonic the rest of her life with the loss of her son. And he said the hardest thing he ever had to do in his life was spending week after week trying to sit in his room or stand in front of his, where he's writing and working and imagining himself into the world of a mother. Here's a man who had no children, right? Philip Roth, and trying to imagine not just what it would be like to be a mother, but then to lose a child. And he talked about very movingly about how that was the hardest thing he has ever done in his life. And those pages really show just how hard he worked at that, and how a tremendous, brilliant genius like Philip Roth is able to make that leap in a way that is incredibly powerful and effective. Whether it is completely ethical and moral, that's another issue and another story for that people are engaging and discussing right now. Right? Should a person who is not a person of color, how do they create characters of people of color? Are they fully able to do that correctly? And I think certainly or do it in a way that is genuinely experiencing the world from that perspective. Obviously, it can't capture all of it, but that's one of the things that great artists are able to do, right? Are able to leap beyond their own knowledge base and try to imagine a world and present it to us. So these are important issues, aesthetic issues and ethical issues that are really at the forefront of our culture right now. So I think, you know, your question, Ashley, gets to the heart of that about how he's creating these characters. And certainly Jewish mothers everywhere have been horrified by, you know, Mrs. Portnoy since Portnoy's complaint, which came out right around when this film, and Roth's fame, I should say, he is number one on the New York Times bestseller list when this film version is coming out. It's no coincidence that this film is coming out as Portnoy's complaint is at the top of the bestseller list in America. And so it's an important question for sure.
Could we hear from Alan and Nita? They have some interesting points of view. Alan, Nita?
You have to unmute.
Nita?
We're trying.
Yeah, we got it. Yeah.
Okay.
We watched this movie last night, the first time in 50 years. And I was, first of all, shocked by how many of the lines I could finish before they said the words. This was a startling movie that was very representative of its time, which was 1969. It was right after the assassinations. It was 3 months before Woodstock. It was during the height of the Vietnam War protests. It was in a time of tumult. And I think that this represented it. And the comment I made on the chat was that I saw the movie, and I saw it when I saw it because my grandparents had seen it the night before, and my grandmother, who was in her late 60s, came out of the movie crying because of its anti-Semitism. And I saw it as something completely different. I saw it as a countercultural manifestation of its time. And I think that it may have bent Roth's intentions a bit to the time, but I think it really still has that 60s flavor. And I was 18 years old at the time, and I just thought it was really kind of wild and crazy.
I thought that there were some really very funny lines in 1969 when we saw it. You know, I'm a liver, I'm a pancreas, you know, that kind of thing. But at the time, those were clever, those were funny. So much of this movie had comments in it that have stuck with us, and to the point that I didn't even remember they had come from this movie until we saw it again last night. It's not necessarily so significant. It just shows how spoiled the little sister was, but you know, we don't play a game without joking, my shoelace is untied, can I take the point over again, in our family. And I hadn't remembered that it, you know, came from this movie. And Sandra, I think I even said to you that there was a scene in there, I remember the wedding so well because they're talking about plastics. Well, it wasn't plastics they were talking about. Yes, that wasn't this movie, but they were measuring the carpet. The two brothers were, you know, going up and down in the hall measuring the carpet, and that was just right on the money. I think that the racial issue was dealt with about as much as it could have been in a movie that hit hot topics like this in a very short time. So I mean, I think it was dealt with, but I think that was as far as it could go at the time.
Mm-hmm. Has it changed? You talked about how powerful it was when you guys saw it when it was coming out at that time. How do you see it now, especially? Do you still see it as, do you think it would be as powerful for a newer generation, or do you see it as being too dated for the newer generation, like Caroline is saying, right?
Yeah, we tried to get our kids to watch it probably 10 years ago, and they couldn't make it through, you know, very many minutes of it. It was so outdated then. It was ridiculous to do it then. But it was was right out there in 1969. Women not wearing bras, just unzipping your dress and, being bare chested. That's what was going on.
Yeah.
Short skirts in college, if you could wear a skirt in college, and people had just moved from pants. From skirts to pants in some schools. Most places it was still just skirts for women. It's terribly dated, but it certainly took me back to 1969.
Yeah.
Right.
So we have about 5 more minutes. Do you want to just quickly ask those remaining questions, Ezra?
Let's see, there's a few that we missed here.
Anna Marie is asking if it was typical for Brendas at that time to go to Boston by themselves. Where's Anna Marie?
Oh, I think we have plenty of people here who can answer that question far better than I might be able to. Who would want to take that one?
Yes. Definitely, yes.
Okay.
Before people, I went to college in the 70s, not the 60s, but I think it was even more so in the 60s that girls would hitchhike. I went to Europe by myself and backpacked through Europe. So going to Boston, I don't think was a big deal.
Thank you. I really meant the question to be to go to university far away from home.
Oh, yeah, I think so. Because Ivy League schools were big and Jewish parents, in my experience, wanted their kids to go to Ivy League schools. So I think yes.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I was all prepared to go to the University of California, Berkeley.
Mhm.
But someone came into my life that lived here in Charleston and went to the Citadel, so plans got changed.
Well, Berkeley and the Citadel, they're basically the same. So
Yeah, right.
we're okay there, right?
I can answer the travel question. And so I went to college in New England in the early 60s. My mother actually put me in a car in Columbia with 2 soldiers who were getting out of Fort Jackson. And that's how I got as far as Philadelphia. And then I got on a train to New York and then went from New York to school in a car. But after that, my parents moved to California. I flew back and forth all the time. There wouldn't have been a question of not traveling by yourself. Also some hitchhiking, but so.
Mary, do you want to paraphrase what you said in the chat? Unmute.
Okay, well, I'd just like to point out that Roth's prose is extremely complex. I reread some of Goodbye Columbus after not having read it since maybe the mid 60s. And my breath was taken away from the very beginning by the beauty of his prose. The idea that that story was written by a 26-year-old man is almost incomprehensible. And I've been a Roth fan most of my life. I dropped out of Roth in the middle of his career because his attitudes towards women they got boring because they were so intensely misogynist, whichever the right word is. Mm-hmm. And then I came back to him in his later career, and I nearly wept with joy because, for me to find authors that are that. Right now, I'm reading the Snopes trilogy of Faulkner, and you have to be able to read the language. You can't look at the images. I found Goodbye to Columbus to be dated in so many ways. I mean, the music hurt my ears. The images. I mean, even the bikini there that Leah mentioned. I don't recall in '69 that we were showing our pubics. I remember them being up waist high. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that was Hollywood. I don't know. I would also like to say that my husband, who grew up in Passaic, now a stone's throw from Newark, and went to school at Rutgers when, and he was only a few years younger than Roth, or still is only a few years younger than Roth would be. He would said to me while we were talking about all this that the characters of Brenda Potemkin's family were much like his own, and it was one of the reasons why he fled home as soon as he could. And I'd also like to say that you know, there is a very big difference between the Northern Jew and the Southern Jew, and there are many you know, reasons for that based on the immigrant experience. We're both very different. So I don't know, that's about it. I do think The Human Stain, it was a much more complex book than the movie turned out to be.
Yes.
As well as, frankly, The Plot Against America was much more complex. And also, what was the other one we mentioned? I thought Indignation was one of the best Roth movies.
Yes.
You do make a good point that if you just saw the movie and did not read the novella, that certainly I urge everyone to read the novella.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with everything that Mary was saying there, especially, you know, the idea of the complexity of the language and the beauty of the images and the metaphors and the structure and all of it. And you're right, when you're reading Faulkner and you're putting Roth by his side there's not a great diminishment there. So that's saying something right there for sure.
No, just Professor Cappell, if I'm saying that correctly.
Sure.
Are you familiar with the film Sanctuary?
Yes.
from the Faulkner novel?
Yes.
I recently reread the novel and I haven't seen the film. I was wondering if it was worth seeing.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, I at some point down the line, I hope to do a course on film adaptations. I don't know about Faulkner, but that could be a larger idea of great American novels that have been adapted into films. But certainly Jewish American novels that have been adapted into films, there's such a wide range at this point that would make for a very interesting course and a lot to think about. But for sure, I think that your point is well taken, right? And that they're very different, very, very different art forms, and that the beauty of each page or each paragraph, sentence by sentence, novella in a film, and that's one of the reasons why many of the attempts have fallen so far short, I think, in terms of that, because, you know, it's less plot heavy and more just the beauty of the language itself, right? And so oftentimes that does get lost. But, you know, there's a lot of great filmmakers out there, and hopefully they'll want to adapt many of his other great works that have not been made into films yet. So thank you for your comments. Very, very well taken. Well,
Can't hear you.
There you go. Okay, I got it. Thanks, husband. I think that we have enough material for another program, so hopefully we can take up Ezra's suggestion and do another program and have a great discussion like we did. I know I learned a lot and gave me definitely many different perspectives on the film, so I thank you all for that very much. Thanks for attending the program tonight. Again, thanks for all the sponsors and support that we get from the Jewish Studies Department. And I do hope that you will attend our other programs. Feel free to email me with any questions or suggestions, sbrettfilm@gmail.com. And I do look forward to seeing you at the movies. Good night, everybody, and thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.